evening, everybody. Welcome to Gresham. My name is Robin May. I am the Gresham Professor of Physics, and for those of you who are about to run out the door, don't panic, I am not giving this lecture. It's my pleasure to be hosting it this evening and to do all the boring bits up front, which I will do now and get rid of, which are about the hall itself. So if this is your first time to Gresham, in fact, let's find out who's here for the first time. Oh, that's a good showing. Excellent. Well, welcome in that case. We hope it's not your last. For those of you who are coming back, I'm glad we did it well the previous time and that you've come back again. So welcome to the lecture. Let me just give a few housekeeping bits before we kick off. First and most importantly, if there is a fire or indeed a fire alarm, we're not expecting any drills, so if it goes off, I will be the first one fleeing rapidly to the back. Follow me or anybody else through the two doors at the back out into the quad, and then we will guide you to safety. Let's hope it doesn't happen. If you're at home listening to the live stream, you're on your own. Can I double check with everybody, phones and other noisy devices? This is your moment to double check they're on silent, please. If your phone goes off and you answer it, people in the hall will get annoyed, and also you will be immortalized on YouTube forever as the person whose phone went off. The lecture is recorded and live broadcast. The cameras that are at the back. Those of you in the audience, don't worry, you are anonymous unless the back of your head is particularly distinctive, because it will not see your faces. And similarly, if you're asking questions at the end, which we do hope you will do, your voice will be heard, but not your face. Last of all, for questions, which we really encourage you to ask. So at the end of the lecture, we hope there'll be some time for questions. And you have two choices. You can do the time-honored thing of sticking your hand up, and a microphone will magically appear from behind you to let you ask your question. Please do wait for the microphone, otherwise all the people listening at home will not have a clue what the question is you asked. Or if you're a bit shy, you can go onto the Slido, onto the web page, and you can put your question into the chat function there. Those of you online, that's your only option because you can't shout from home. It will magically appear on my iPad here, and I will do my best to ask your question for you. So be thinking of your questions as you go through. That's all the housekeeping. So without further ado, let me introduce this evening's speaker, who is a long-standing friend of Gresham, Professor Malcolm Andrews, who has been previously here on many occasions talking about all sorts of things. And we were just discussing behind the scenes, and I think he has the best of all worlds, because he has essentially two jobs, one talking about landscape painting and the other talking about Dickens. And tonight, you're going to hear the former, celebrating 200 years of this fabulous painting from Constable. By day, he is Emeritus Professor at the University of Kent. And by the evening, he is our Gresham Professor of the evening. So welcome, Malcolm. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robin. I should say reciprocally that I discovered when I met Robin this evening that he's due to be here tomorrow talking about why do we grieve. So I suddenly thought I'd better end on an upbeat note with this one, just to, by way of contrast. Anyway, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this evening to join me in celebrating a birthday of an old and very valued friend. Up there. I should say that particular reproduction doesn't necessarily accurately reflect the painting that is hanging on the walls of the National Gallery, nor will several subsequent versions of it. It's a bit difficult to control the thing. The colour balance is often out, and it sort of slightly reshapes the mood. And I realized that today, because earlier today we went to the Turner Constable exhibition at Tate, and seeing a number of constables that I knew very well indeed, I thought, and having been used to dealing with slides for so often, I thought, that's not the Haywain. The Haywain should be brighter than that. It should be a bit more saturated in colour. But anyway, that's... Hold on for 1 second. Yeah. Am I coming apart?
You are coming apart.
Right, okay, good, yeah. Anyway, that's just by way of caution, but it does project a nice bright image for this. So anyway, I'm going to be saying something in a bit more detail about the shape of the talk this evening in a little while, but I would like to just launch straight into the birth and the infancy of the picture that I'm talking about this evening. 200 years ago, this month, and about a 40-minute walk west from where we are this evening, John Constable began work on a large canvas, really quite a large canvas, 1.5 meters in height and 1.25 meters wide. Constable was in his 50th year, living with his family up in Hampstead and commuting back and forth to his studio in Charlotte Street, just off Oxford Street, in the heart of London's West End. So there, in the midst of the most densely populated urban centre in the world, he painted this memory of a remote, secluded summer landscape in rural Suffolk, a dappled, shady lane in the foreground, and in the distance, a glowing field of ripe corn, under a sky alive with scudding clouds. All this remembered from his younger days. A shepherd boy pauses in the lane with his dog and his small flock of sheep to drink from a pool. The memory must have seemed then about as distant in time as the Suffolk scene was in remoteness from his city studio. The painting was finished in time for the Royal Academy's spring exhibition. Constable wrote to a friend to say that he had real hopes of selling the picture, and I quote, "It has got a little more eye salve than I usually condescend to give them." By eye salve, Constable is supposed to be referring to his inclusion of some stock rustic accessories, the donkeys, the flock of sheep, the broken gate, the strolling reaper, maybe even the distant church tower. These he organizes into a composition that suggests an ideal social and cultural order. The distant church tower is symbolically keyed as the end point of a succession of diagonals drawing together the human and animal presences in the landscape, starting at the drinking boy's elbow, passing along the angled stance of the donkey foal, continued in the slant of the broken gate, and echoed in the reaper's shouldered scythe. The painting was exhibited at the Royal Academy under the title Landscape Noon, no mention of Cornfield. The following year, it spent several months in Paris under the rather bald title Landscape with Figures and Animals. The painting never found a buyer in Constable's lifetime. He put it into 5 separate exhibitions over his last decade, and no sale was made. This melancholy history gives an ironic reflection to Constable's own offhand remark in a letter of 1832, "My limited and abstracted art is to be found under every hedge and in every lane, and therefore nobody thinks it worth picking up." Well, nobody did pick this one up. Constable died in March 1837. In the summer of that year, a group of his admirers proposed to buy the painting for the nation by organizing a subscription appeal. They put a price of 300 guineas on it, a sum that they reached by the end of that year. Among the 100 or so subscribers were some famous names, including the poet William Wordsworth and the scientist Michael Faraday. The painting was then given to the National Gallery in its handsome new premises in Trafalgar Square. The proceeds from the subscription went to Constable's children, Constable himself having been widowed for the last decade of his life. It was only then that Constable's noon landscape received its current and familiar title, the Cornfield. One of England's most popular countryside images has been living in the centre of London for the last 2 centuries, with occasional brief exhibition tours to other parts of Britain and overseas. What has been its appeal over this time, and what might it be saying to us now after 200 years? So I'll be exploring the painting's topography and titling, and the influences from landscape traditions that helped to shape the cornfield, and then consider the picture's changing reception over the last 2 centuries. And I'd like to close with speculation on its value for us today. with our heightened preoccupation about the relationship between the natural world and the human presence, and our environmental anxieties. So first of all, topography. The scene that grew slowly on that canvas in Charlotte Street was Constable's memory of a Suffolk country lane, Fen Lane, leading from his birthplace village of East Bergholt down into the water meadows by the River Stour. The lane itself, now called Fenbridge Lane, was one that had special personal significance for Constable. It was the route that he used to take to school when a boy, walking from East Bergholt and crossing the river to reach Dedham village, where he attended grammar school. The painting captures a particular spot, a gentle double bend in the lane at a junction with a smaller path coming out from a field on the right. That break in the line of trees and hedge lets sunlight onto the lane's foreground. On the left, the bank swells out to cup a small pond fed by the stream that runs down the side of the lane and eventually into the Stour. I think I found the original spot. About 2/3 of the way down the lane, the path curves sinuously around a protruding bank where the stream pools out and a field entrance opens on the right. We found it on a walk with my son and his wife a few years ago. I was taking photos when my son volunteered to be the drinking boy, complete with a red top. He flung himself down on the grassy bank, and the grassy bank turned out to be a bed of nettles. But he's a professional ecologist, so his gallantry was all in a day's work. Dedham, at that point, is some way over to the right. But Constable wanted its square church tower in his landscape, so he moved it east to become an eye-catcher just beyond his field of corn. When Constable began his work on the painting in his London studio, he was drawing on his memories, but also on a number of studies that he'd made of the scene and its various components. In his younger days in Suffolk, and his subsequent visits there from his London homes, he made many, many such sketches of local scenery, spending hours out in the fields and lanes, recording what he saw and, just as importantly, how he felt. How he felt. Painting, he said, is for me but another word for feeling. His friend and Constable's biographer, Charles Leslie, tells us a curious proof of the stillness with which Constable had sat one day while painting in the open air was the discovery of a field mouse in his coat pocket. Constable absorbed the full, immediate sensory experience of being out in the open countryside on such occasions. And to help with that concentration, he told Leslie, "The first thing I try to do is to forget that I've ever seen a picture." Back in his studio, however, his inspirations were both topographical and artistic. So I want to move on to the landscape models. Constable drew on his favorite models of landscape art, and in particular, the two leading European landscape traditions of the time. One was the 17th century Dutch school, and Constable had a sentimental affinity with these artists. As he remarked once, the Dutch painters were stay-at-home people, hence their originality. They didn't go wafting off onto the grand tour. The landscape of the Low Countries was of a character that in many respects matched that of England's East Anglia, the relative flatness, for one thing. The Dutch painters made up for the lack of dramatic contours by concentrating on more textured, rougher scenery, rutted paths, broken banks, low-profile cottages, big skies with rich and varied patterns. It's easy to see correspondences between Constable and these painters. In that early sketch on the right, for the Cornfields Lane. Constable also admired the Italian landscapes of the French painter Claude Lorrain and made copies of them. One in particular was entitled Landscape with a Goat Herd and Goats. Here's what Constable said about it in 1823 while he was copying it at the house of the grand country house of his patron, Sir George Beaumont, who had a number of Claude paintings that he encouraged Constable to copy. And Constable's, what Constable said about it that year and his comments generally on it correspond quite closely with what he was to say about his Cornfield painting just 2 years later. It contains almost all that I wish to do in landscape. It's a noonday scene which, quote, warms and cheers, but which does not inflame or irritate. Mr. Price. It diffuses a life and breezy freshness into the recesses of trees, which makes it enchanting. And then here's what he says in describing the cornfield a little later. It's an inland study. Cornfields, a close lane kind of thing. The trees are shaken by a pleasant and healthful breeze at noon. While now a fresher gale sweeping with shadowy gusts the fields of corn, etc., etc. I'll come back to that shadowy gust quotation in a minute. The mysterious reference to Mr. Price and his comments about irritation refer to Sir Uvedale Price. And he was a Herefordshire squire and connoisseur who wrote a very influential book on the aesthetics of the picturesque as distinct from the beautiful in landscape painting and in the art of landscape gardening. The picture viewer's eye, according to Price, is pleasantly irritated and stimulated by passing back and forth over the rough textures and broken contours that characterize picturesque compositions. So ruined abbeys and old thatched cottages, for instance, and indeed dilapidated peasants and gypsies. They're all irritants, pleasant irritants to the eye. Irritation, he wrote, is indeed a source of our most active and lively pleasures. As a certain degree of stimulus or irritation is necessary to the picturesque, so, on the other hand, a soft and pleasing repose is equally the effect and the characteristic of the beautiful, characterized by il riposo di Claudio. And when the mind of man feels that mild and equal sunshine of the soul, which warms and cheers, but neither inflames nor irritates, his heart seems to dilate with happiness. Constable has absorbed that sense of the attractions of visual irritation and blended it with his feeling for scenic beauty, and I think that's at the core of the cornfield. The cornfield has this distinctive balance between il riposo, the versions of ancient pastoral, in the drinking shepherd boy, the trudging labourer, the grazing donkeys, the ambling sheep, and the dog pausing in the lane, between that and agitation in the vitality of the wind, tousling the treetops, the massing clouds, the lively contrasts of shade and sunlight, and the rutted surface of the lane and broken bank. As can be seen from these details of trees and sky up there on the left, compared with the Claudian version below, Constable departs from that riposo when it comes to his English skies, full of the picturesque stimulus of irritation and flickering highlights. Constable wanted his landscapes to have that sensory impact that he himself had experienced in the fields. These are the sensations that Constable wants from his paintings, described in 2 or 3 letters, which I've telescoped together: lively and soothing, calm and exhilarating, fresh and blowing, light, dews, breezes, bloom and freshness, not one of which has yet been perfected on the canvas of any painter in the world. And that, I suppose, is his pitch for originality. He feels that he's doing something, or wanting to do something that really hasn't been done before, to capture a kind of sensation coming from the paintings that you wouldn't get from any other landscape painter. I go now to the titles. Title plural. Constable's title for this painting, when he sent it off to the Academy in April 1826, was Landscape Noon, as I mentioned. It was exhibited again the next year at the British Institution under the same title, but this time with a quotation accompanying its catalogue entry, a quotation that Constable wanted added as a kind of reinforcement to the painting. A fresher gale begins to wave the woods and stir the stream, sweeping with shadowy gusts the fields of corn. These lines come from the 18th century poet James Thomson's long poem, The Seasons. Thomson, a poet who's often quoted by both Constable and Turner, rapturously invoked nature as the great parent whose unceasing hand rolls round the seasons of the changeful year. How mighty, how majestic are thy works. Remember that apostrophe to the great parent, because I'll be coming back to that. So Constable must have added that quotation to try to focus the really salient effect that he wanted his picture to have. The various formal titles that I've listed up there, which this painting had, was exhibited under, don't seem to know quite where to settle the focus. Constable informally referred to it in his letters as my drinking boy. So what is the principal focus, the leading motif in this painting? The lane? Is it the cornfield? Is it the human narrative? Or should it just be the time of day and high summer? Constable had described it as a close lane kind of thing. But I think he relished a composition that had that stimulating contrast of a close, shady seclusion with those towering treetops on the edge of a bright open landscape. That sudden contrast. And that might explain why he chose to paint this scene, surprisingly, in portrait rather than landscape format. We should be turning the screens up that way to get the effect that Constable wanted. The upright format he chose, presumably because it could convey better the close-up majesty of those trees as they're being, in his words, shaken by a pleasant and healthful breeze. Constable very often mentions this word healthful or healthy. Constable's decision to add that quotation does suggest that his main aim in recreating this familiar scene was to represent the play of nature's forces, not so much the human narrative as what's going on, the energies at loose in the natural world. The wind tugging at the foliage and sweeping light and shadow across the fields and the lane. Effect was what he wanted in his landscape, almost a kind of haptic effect upon the viewer. I like the landscapes of Constable, one of his Academy colleagues said on one occasion. I like the landscapes of Constable, but he always makes me call for my greatcoat and umbrella. And Constable was delighted when on one occasion he received a commission for a landscape from someone who said he'd deliberately come to Constable because he wanted a painting in which, quote, he could feel the wind blowing in his face. So now to the legacy. And what I'm going to be talking about here, for that, I owe a great deal to these three books, which I strongly recommend. I particularly recommend the chapter in Stephen Daniels' book, Fields of Vision, the chapter John Constable and the Making of Constable Country. It's very rich in detail and with a very stimulating and incisive commentary. It's very strongly recommended. Constable had a real struggle to make headway against academic prejudices about his idiosyncratic handling. He recognized this. He said, "My pictures will never be popular, for they had no handling. But I do not see handling in nature." By handling, Constable, I assume, refers to Royal Academy training in brushwork to achieve a smooth, refined surface and sustained gracefulness of line. His own rough dabs and flickering, dewy sparkle were often achieved with palette knife strokes of pure white pigment, sometimes even mixing that with powdered mica to give a real glint off the canvas's surface. Nature's scenes for him were colours and light and shade, rather than carefully defined material objects. I quote, "Constable did not see lines, but spaces." Constable did not see lines, but spaces, a critic later in the 19th century. One academician, a friend of Constable's, thinking that he would help Constable on one of the Royal Academy's varnishing days, took one look at one of these landscapes with the sort of flickering, dewy lights on it, and thinking, as I said, that he was going to help Constable's chances, seized a brush and applied a thick coat of bitumen glaze over the foreground. Constable was horrified, mortified, and said, "There goes all my due." His handling didn't go down well with the art establishment, nor with a public who was attracted by the grand style in paintings and by the bright precision detailings of the pre-Raphaelites under Ruskin's patronage. Up there on the right, you can see one of these, a spring painting by Inchbold with primroses and the root of a tree, minutely picked out in detail, and underneath that, Constable's idiosyncratic handling. Ruskin himself was pretty savage towards Constable, saying he chose subjects of a low order and that he was unable to draw. Subjects of a low order and he couldn't draw. But these two key characteristics, the choice of unassuming English countryside and the very free, loose handling, constituted Constable's greatest career disadvantages in terms of Royal Academy recognition and indeed maybe picture sales, because he sold very, very few during his lifetime. But ironically, those same two characteristics became his greatest legacy. In the decades immediately following his death in 1837, his reputation in England rose hardly at all. But in France, it was very different. There, the showing of Constable's work strongly influenced the Barbizon school's plein air painting. Delacroix acclaimed Constable as the father of modern French landscape. And in terms of technique, he was later hailed as a precursor to the Impressionists and to some modernist modes. So that's one legacy. What about the other legacy, the supposed essential Englishness of his Suffolk landscapes? This association of the painter and his local landscapes with the national identity was made very early on. In fact, at the very first public exhibition of the Cornfield at the Royal Academy in May 1826. One reviewer, evidently much impressed by what he saw as the painting's honest integrity, conflated the character of the subject matter with the character of the handling and the character of the painter. I quote, "A more delightful specimen of genuine English scenery and English atmosphere we never beheld. It's painted in a fine, vigorous, and masterly style without any ambitious refinements or affectation of effect." And Constable, I think, would have been thrilled by this welcoming of genuine English scenery represented in unaffected, naturalistic manner. It was the legacy that he wanted to leave us. And that's clear from his publication, Various Subjects of Landscape Characteristic of English Scenery, 1830-1833. And this was a series of prints made from his paintings, best known now by its short title, English Landscape Scenery. The aim of this, according to Constable's introduction, was to increase the interest for and promote the study of the rural scenery of England, with all its endearing associations, its amenities, and even its most simple localities. Constable was defying the conventions of heroic or historical landscape. There were no sublime mountains or waterfalls or romantically ruined castles or abbeys. Rather, his landscapes were designed to give pleasure by the homely variety of lanes and fields and trees and rural folk going about their daily lives and work. He argued that the simplest localities and most banal scenery could always be rendered beautiful by chiaroscuro. He famously remarked, "I never saw an ugly thing in my life. I never saw an ugly thing in my life. For let the form of an object be what it may, light, shade, and perspective will always make it beautiful." So through these means, Constable celebrated and elevated the ordinary. And of course, this is what made him so attractive to the Impressionists. Here's an appraisal of Constable 40 years after the Cornfield's first exhibition, as we sort of move along in this tracking of the legacy. Constable was entirely English in the subjects he chose. Locally English, no doubt, but still purely English. Look at any or all of his pictures and see how England rises before us. England, in all her wealth of picturesque beauty, not trimmed and frounced, not clipped and cropped, as the corn manufacturers disfigure her, but English nature as it holds its own in our rude heaths and ferny commons. Notice how this pure Englishness in landscape terms seems to be going into retreat. In his painting, The Cornfield, the trim, cultivated cornfield itself is just a slip of gold in the middle distance. The rich detailing is all reserved for the lane's wild variety. Pure English nature is now to be found only or mainly in those dwindling, uncultivated scenes, heaths and commons and old lanes. In other words, to be found in the old world left behind by intensive modern farming, enclosures, industrialization, and spreading urbanization. A world that by the turn of the century became identified particularly with England's southeastern counties and became known sentimentally as the South Country. Constable's scenes thus come to be regarded as the portraiture of old traditional England, and this encouraged later tourism to the locations of his paintings, almost as if the tourists were journeying back into a past to which they felt they had once partly belonged. So I want to consider the Constable legacy as a tourist attraction briefly. The branding of Constable's home region had already begun in his own lifetime. In November 1832, Constable wrote to a friend, "In the coach yesterday, coming from Suffolk, were two gentlemen and myself, all strangers to each other. In passing through the valley about Dedham, one of them remarked to me, on my saying it was beautiful, 'Yes, sir, this is Constable's country.' I then told him who I was, lest he should spoil it." By the last decades of the 19th century, Cook's tours had included in their menu of excursions a visit to Constable's country. There was a thrill in discovering any continuity between Constable's English countryside and the modern world. For instance, in the 1890s, one tourist in Constable's birthplace village, East Berkholt, met a man who said that his uncle had posed for the drinking boy in the cornfield. But it was the Haywain location that drew most of the tourist trade, as indeed it does today, the site being barely a mile away from Fenbridge Lane. In the 1920s, And you can see some of these in the photos on the slide. In the 1920s, the decaying Flatford Mill and Willie Lott's picturesque cottage were restored by a local builder and philanthropist, Thomas Parkington, who wished eventually to gift the estate to the nation as a precious heritage, I quote, for the encouragement of outdoor landscape painting and to preserve the beauties of the English countryside. Parkington died in 1942. And the following year, the Flatford estate was acquired by the National Trust. It was an auspicious time for such a gift to the nation. It was the middle of World War II, a time of heightened nationalism and intensified feelings for what might be lost from, quote, the beauties of the English countryside. 2 years earlier, the art critic Herbert Reed had declared that the English countryside was exactly what we are fighting for, a green and pleasant land, a landscape whose features have been moulded by liberty, where every winding lane and irregular building is an expression of our national character. You can decide whether or not that still stands as characterizing our national identity. But Constable's Cornfield had foregrounded versions of just these features: the lane lazily meandering through sunlight and shadow, and the old field gate resting off its hinges, relaxing its disciplinary duties. Both of these express a kind of liberty, thereby apparently codifying landscape motifs into emblems of the national character. Crises of confidence, as in time of war and threat of invasion, heighten the impulse to idealize between the human, and produce counter-images of harmony between individuals, between classes, between the human and the natural world, images that serve both public propaganda and private solace. And I just want to strike off on a tangent for a moment. A few years ago, Tate Britain mounted a major retrospective of the work of the photographer Don McCullin. His celebrated war photographs were on display, of course. So were a number of his English landscape works. One display wall showed photographs taken near his home in Somerset, enclosed views of woods and water hovering in a palpable stillness. Beside these images was this quotation from McCullin: "I dream of this when I'm in battle. I think of misty England." These local Somerset scenes had distilled for him something about the national character of the landscape as a quiet sanctuary from a world of harrowing violence and destruction. This particular landscape struck me in the context of our main topic this evening, its affinities with the cornfield. In both landscapes, a meandering path, figured as a shadowy lane or a sluggish stream, starts from some foreground stumps and passes by an old gate loosened from its supports. I wrote to McCullin to ask if he was familiar with Constable's Cornfield. I never got a reply, so I don't know whether that older landscape had lodged somewhere in McCullin's mind. But this brings me to consider the extent to which the cornfield has indeed become part of the furniture of the national psyche. This was tested in 1996, when the National Gallery mounted a small exhibition organized around its precious possession entitled "At Home with Constable's Cornfield." For this, they invited the public to contribute records of any reproductions of the picture they might have in any form about their home, not just framed copies on their walls, but biscuit tin lids, wallpaper, cushion covers, tea trays, and so on. They had over 500 responses. Reproductions of Constable's work evidently featured in households across the whole diverse social group. Photos of these cornfield-themed objects were collected and sampled in a book by Colin Painter, the originator of the idea for the exhibition. They were accompanied by a range of written responses to the painting from a very wide variety of people and backgrounds. The book is fascinating, At Home with Constable's Cornfield. Some of these I find very touching. For instance, this from a retired man, John Cranham. Aunt Louise introduced me to art. She used to say that when she was lonely, she used to sit and look at this painting and imagine she was wandering up through the lane until she disappeared out of view. It's a mysterious resonance. One striking response that I want to linger on came from Patricia Rostigan, who styles herself housewife and mother. And her sentiment will take us through to the last part of my talk. I think the painting is about trust. The little boy who's looking away from the herd is trusting his dog. The man in the field is also trusting the dog not to let the sheep into the field. The boy trusts the fact that the stream is going to be clear and he can drink it. The trees are dying, but there are new ones to replace them, so there's a sort of eternal feeling. It gives a sense of security. You need to feel at home in the world. A code of trust seems to secure the dense weave of old country life, and it's working with nature. There's no hurry to repair that broken gate in the centre. The sheep won't stray into the cornfield. Trees will always regenerate. So in a way will those sheep, with the raddle marks on their backs to show they'll procreate. Water will always be there, even in high summer, and anyone can drink safely from nature's source. Patricia's trust is an elusive experience, a sort of eternal feeling, she describes it, a wished-for sense of being at home in the world, and not just in your actual home, at home in the world. Well, these are responses of a generation ago. So finally, let's think about the cornfield now, in what's being called this post-nature time of ours. I'll title this section Patricia's Trust. Let me fill in some context for this post-nature idea, and then bring it to bear on how we might see the cornfield now. In 1989, the environmentalist Bill McKibben published a book with the sensational title, The End of Nature. By the end of nature, he meant not the end of the world, but the slow extinction of the idea of nature as, quote, the separate and wild province, the world apart from man to which he adapted, under whose rules he was born and died. Now that we have produced the carbon dioxide, we have ended nature, McKibben argued. Now that we have changed the weather, we make every spot on the earth man-made and artificial. Thus, there's no longer any independent nature. Quote, nature's independence is its meaning. Without it, there is nothing but us. We live in a post-natural world. There's no outside anymore. Everything is somehow inside. There is nothing but us is quite a chilling statement. And of course, there are groups who might well wish to distance themselves from McKibben's postulated we and us, such as farmers, perhaps, people from indigenous cultures. But this post-nature is equivalent to the term Anthropocene, coined in the 1980s to denote the period now reached when planet Earth is believed to have become almost wholly subject to human impact, to atomic radiation fallout, to human-induced climate change, to dwindling biodiversity, and pervasive microplastic pollution. Since at least the time of Constable and his contemporary William Wordsworth, that's the high noon of English Romanticism, there have been anxieties over the alienation of human beings from nature. But the issue has intensified recently. An organization called Lawyers for Nature campaigned to establish rights of nature, just like human rights. And running with sympathy with that has come a new respect for the animism of indigenous cultures, for whom rivers and mountains have always had a personhood organically connected as part of their community. Robert Macfarlane's recent book about rivers addresses that very eloquently. A couple of years ago, a campaigning group of environmental activists linked with the Lawyers for Nature noticed that most current English dictionaries were defining nature as separate from and antithetical to humans and human creations. The august Oxford English Dictionary had included, as one of its definitions under nature, in a wider sense, the whole of the natural world, including humans and the cosmos. But it had since then designated that inclusive sense as obsolete since 1873. The campaigning group managed to persuade the OED editors to remove the obsolete label. So this successful OED challenge was a small but significant victory. However, much of our day-to-day discourse seems silently to acknowledge that we live detached from nature. We casually use phrases like back to nature or reconnect with nature or bring nature in, all of which imply that our actual habitat is somewhere other than nature and that nature is something out there, often worth visiting for recreational purposes or for mental, spiritual, and physical health. Patricia's "we need to feel at home in the world" takes on significance here. Nature's becoming commodified, a commodified other, a therapeutic resource recognized and instrumentalized as such, both for the private home, as with all those domestic cornfield reproductions, and institutionally. One quick example. In a spacious hospital waiting room, video panel scenes, set like windows into the walls, offer bright, groomed landscapes in high color saturation, drifting very slowly across the screens to soothe the nerves of waiting patients. Watching nature programs makes you happier was the title of a BBC article publishing the findings of a research study in 2017. The attribution of nature's mental health benefits afforded either immersively, such as forest bathing or even in artificial representation, as in the ornamental cornfield decorations, is epitomized, I think, in the videos released just only about 10 days ago by the Princess of Wales, entitled Mother Nature, if anyone has seen those. And that's an old attribute, Mother Nature. A mother obviously reinforces that sentiment of Patricia's "we need to feel at home in the world." You may recall my quoting James Thompson's apostrophe to nature as our great parent. Mother Nature and great parent cast us as nature's children. So suppose we press this family metaphor further. In the natural course of family life, children eventually become the carers of their aging and perhaps ailing parents. And perhaps we've reached this stage with parent nature, who is increasingly seen as a frailer, shrunken version of its former self, not necessarily spontaneously regenerating, often in need of conservation intervention. Can we any longer think of nature as the secure parent provider, when nature is increasingly cordoned off into parkland care homes and respectfully foraged for mindfulness prescriptions? Can we, in other words, still share Patricia's trust in nature's self-sufficiency, robust self-sufficiency, as she described her deepest feelings about the cornfield? Notwithstanding Constable's thoughtful injection 200 years ago of some extra eye salve into his landscape, I wonder now to what extent our gaze on this painting might be tainted by the rising anxieties of our age. Can we trust the water in the drinking pool, that it isn't polluted? Is that dying tree in the foreground showing signs of a disease that might threaten the lane's other trees? Dutch elm, ash dieback, oak wilt, so on. Is that little boy really safe all on his own? Might some of those field workers be victims of exploited labour. I only partly caricature, but let me close on a more upbeat note with a parting look at this scene. As that project, At Home with Constable's Cornfield, suggested in its range of gathered responses, Constable's landscape offers us an image of something that's gone missing in people's lives. Call it trust, a lost culture, a mythical England, a healthy ecosystem, nature as home. Constable creates an ideal balance in the relationship between humans, animals, and the natural world more broadly, and also an image of nature's quiet promise of material sustenance. The brook still filling the drinking pool in high summer, the ripe corn ready for harvest, the ambling flock. Brook, corn, sheep, water, bread, meat, wool. That human nature balance is articulated and extended throughout the composition, reconciling opposites, a balance between cultivation and the wild, utility and beauty, riposo and irritation, lively and soothing, work and leisure, shade and sunlight, warm and cool colouring, age and youth figured in the field man and the boy, the dying and the flourishing trees, the donkey and its little foal. But Constable's balance doesn't mean stasis. It's not a stagnant pastoral. And it takes us back to that original title, Landscape Noon. He catches a time of day in transition, poised at noon, with the rain clouds coming in and that shadowy gust. His landscape accepts and celebrates transitoriness and mutability. Constable's aim, as he said of his English landscape scenery project, was to give to one brief moment caught from fleeting time a lasting and sober existence. This moment will soon pass, and the lane will be empty. But the painting lingers on, now 200 years old. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Margot. I have definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure others have too. We have just over 5 minutes left for some questions. So just to remind people in the room, you can either raise your hand or you can zap that magical QR code and ask on here. Those of you listening online, please post your questions and they will appear on my iPad. So shall we start in the room? Does anybody have a question for Malcolm whilst they're here? Yes, so you're at the front. Hold on for the microphone, which is zooming up in front of you.
Thank you. I was interested in the title of the piece. It was given by his friends, and my first thought when you started talking about it was, it's not an appropriate title. It should be Lane, or Suffolk Lane, or something. And then you expanded, and he had actually called it the Cornfields in its time. But I'm still not convinced. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, yes, I agree. I mean, he called it his drinking boy, as I said, as if he hadn't got a title for it. But, I mean, the one title that we know he did choose was Landscape Noon, which is what he sent it out as. And in the end, juggling with all of the other ones, identifying particular areas of the picture to fill out, I think that's probably the best. Because Landscape Noon comprehends all of the cornfield, the lane, the drinking boy, and the animals and so on that the other titles have tried to come up with. But it is an interesting question. And indeed, the Haywain was originally Landscape Noon. And I don't know who gave the Haywain the title the Haywain, but it seems that they need to gravitate towards actually some material object in it, or some narrative in it, instead of what Constable wanted was noon and the breezes. I mean, everything he said about the picture strongly suggests that his main motive is this one of effect, of touching the reader, touching the viewer, brushing the viewer with the wind, these healthful breezes, and so on, and giving a kind of exhilarated, immersive feeling about the whole area, and not just the humans or the animals or a particular lane. So it's not really topographical in that sense, I think, but it's a good question. Yeah.
One right at the front. Keep you running, microphone runner.
I have a slightly left field question, following on actually about the title, which was if Constable had ever said anything about or ever had any interest in the enclosure of the land, because on the one hand, it's a picture that has a timeless quality, quite a tranquil quality to it. On the other hand, the title which was selected is The Cornfield. We look behind the lane, which is an old, quite established lane to a very large field. And that's a field which 100 years before, possibly 50 years before, would likely have been strips. I don't know the history of Suffolk well enough to comment. So actually it's, on the one hand, a picture of a traditional landscape, but on the other hand, a picture that points to the modernity of the landscape and its position in time. And I was wondering if those observations had any basis in what Constable said or understood.
Yes, I don't know. I don't know of anything that I can think of in terms of what Constable might have said about it. But are you identifying the modern with the field of corn, essentially? Yes, the cultivated part. Yes, I mean, one of the things that's interested me, sort of coming out of that question, is why Constable didn't go further up the lane to take his viewpoint, so that those wonderful trees, and you could still have the rutted part of the lane, but there'd be a kind of frame for the cornfield and then the view beyond. It's too late to ask him, but that's why I feel that that he's marginalised the modern there. If we take that field as modern, it's just it's a burst of light, a beautiful burst of light. But the title, "The Cornfield," seems so misguided as a title, precisely for that reason.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Malcolm, thank you for that. One of the things you didn't mention in the picture are the clouds, which I think are kind of darkening. And for me, that creates a kind of tension. This is a snapshot. And the clouds denote to me that it's about to change.
Yes.
Is that?
Well, that's what I was finishing on, really, that it is, he loves the transition.
Yeah.
He loves the sense of movement, that time does pass. It invigorates pastoral, which can be a kind of dead, a fairly dead traditional form. But I don't know if this gives it, this reproduction doesn't really give that darker cloud coming in from the top left. Which,
they're wonderful clouds.
Yes, they are, which is a kind of rain cloud, and then there's another smear over the other side of the thing. And he chose that quotation from Thomson, italicizing the last line, the shadowy gust, sweeping with shadowy gust across the fields. And there you've got movement, you've got a lot of movement, but you've got shadow. The clouds are casting shadow, that there may be rain coming, but it's a living landscape. And I mean, you're right, the activity of the sky is wonderful. And I think Constable said something like the sky is the key. Skies are the key for landscape. And he did these extraordinary cloud studies, which are very well represented in the exhibition at the Tate. Lots and lots of cloud studies.
Let me finish, if I may, with one final question from online, who's asking about, in particular, the Captain Swing riots of the period, but I guess more generally, this is a period of great kind of social upheaval. And to what extent do you think that had an impact on Constable's work and his choice of topics?
Yes, well, this is a contentious issue. The historians, the sort of Marxist-inclined art historians in that the last 20, 30 years of the last century made a lot of this, that Constable's pastoral scenes glossed over a lot of the swing riots. the unrest in the countryside. It was particularly bad in East Anglia, too. And they have an argument. But I'm not sure that Constable was quite so deliberately idealizing or veiling what's going on. I think Samuel Palmer, his later contemporary, was doing more than that. But it's tricky with Constable because so often his pioneering painterly naturalism makes you think that everything is documentary. I mean, he's so careful with trees and the rest of it. You think everything else is documentary, but painterly naturalism doesn't translate into social realism. And I think it's easy to make that, to slide from one to the other.
Super. Bang on 7 o'clock. We better draw it to a close there. So all that remains for me to say is, particularly for those of you who it's your first time, if you enjoyed this, please do look online. We have literally thousands of hours of back catalogue if you'd like to have a look. Thank you again for all of you for coming, and in particular, thank you to our excellent speaker, Malcolm. Hope to see you again. Thank you.